Okay, so for time's sake, I'm not going to get into the entire history of California, but I will show you what we're kind of working with here. Up before 1850. So 1848, 1849 is when the gold rush started. And that's happening up in the mountains. So Sacramento is basically like the perfect midpoint between the Bay Area and the mountains where everybody's heading up to. So this becomes sort of like a central hub. And in 1854, it becomes the capital. But in 1850, all these ships are coming up the river. And at that time, the river and the city are the exact same level. Before anyone had settled here, the Native Americans warned everyone not to settle in such proximity to the river because it floods every year, but they settled anyway. And so what happened was a yearly occurrence of flooding. So starting in 1850, whenever this became the main hub, and everybody was coming through on the ships, there was a ship that docked here, and somebody on that ship had cholera. And they didn't quarantine that ship soon enough, so the cholera kind of ran rampant through the entire city. So this was in early mid-December that this started happening. And so this is right whenever the rains are coming, and the rains are just not letting up, and the entire city is flooding. So the city's flooding, and we're also being hit with a cholera epidemic. So people are dropping like flies because one day they'll be fine, and then the next day they could be hit and die because it's such a quick moving disease. So on top of all that flood water, that's completely filling the first floors. From right over here, you can see that's a parking lot right across the street, and that parking lot dips down like an entire story, and so do most of the back alleys around here, and that's the original level of the city. So in 1850, that was the level of the city, and what we're on now was technically the second story. So in 1850, all this was just, the entire first floor was filled with water. And because people were dying so fast from the cholera, the bodies were they were scattered pretty much all around the place. They couldn't get them buried fast enough. Truck came by. But they started off with coffins, but then so many people started dying that they couldn't even get shrouds on them anymore. And they were kind of using the first floor as like a basement to store all those people that had passed. But because the waters were rushing so fast, a lot of those people got carried out, either out of the first floor or sometimes even out of the more shallow graves that they had made. And so those were just kind of floating down the street. And eventually that cleared up, the cholera cleared up, the flood stopped, and it moved on. So every year after that, it would continue to flood because that's just what happens here in the winter. It rains a lot. So 1851, it flooded. 1852, I'm not sure if it flooded, but on Black Tuesday, the city burnt down a lot of it. There's one building on the main street that's still original because it was made of brick. It survived that, but a lot of it just completely burned down. So then 1853, it flooded again. So finally, in 1862, they started what we called the high grading project. And so it took an entire year, but 1862 and 1863, a lot of these businesses were either jacked up an entire floor into what is now the second story, or what was then the second story is now the first story, or they would just build more stories on top of the original and use those the original floors as like sort of a basement. So a lot of them now, a lot of the businesses now in like downtown or here use them as kind of like a storage space. So yeah, a lot of the flooding that would just completely come and destroy businesses and homes, and the bodies that were displaced from it, and the diseases and the fires. There was just a lot that impacted the city in such a short amount of time. But yeah, I managed to condense it. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.